We're starting a brand new series today called Troubled Hearts, and we're not talking about our physical hearts because I'm not a doctor and I don't want to pretend to be one. There's a lot of similarities between our physical hearts and our spiritual hearts. For example, our physical hearts can have a condition, it could have some blockage, it could have some challenges, and they can go undetected for years. Had a good friend of mine had gone through life, and he's about 50 some years old, and all of a sudden he feels chest pains, goes to the doctor, not really know when it is. They do a bunch of exams. They realize that he had blockage in two of his arteries. His thoughts were like, where did this come from? Like, I've lived a healthy life. I've had no symptoms directly associated to his heart. And so as he sat down with the doctor explained to him that many times the conditions of our heart, or the failures of our heart, are shown through other conditions or other symptoms like back pain or fatigued or a hard time sleeping or a hard time breathing. And it has nothing to do directly with your heart, but everything to do with your heart. But we're not talking about that heart. We're talking about our spiritual heart. We're talking about that heart that many philosophers have talked about, that many poets and preachers talk about, that heart that Taylor Swift talks about. I got someone's attention. And it's that heart that many times is broken. It's also the heart that many times is proud, whether your child achieved something or graduated or hit a milestone. It's the heart that kind of feels different when you hear that song from your childhood era, or you smell that perfume or cologne that brought you back to an era in your life when you were dating. And that heart begins to feel stuff, and you don't kind of know where it's coming or how it's working, but it's there, right? And that's the kind of heart we're talking about in this series. Now, the challenging thing about the heart is that the heart is mysterious. Many times the heart is confusing, and many times the heart is wonderful and beautiful. Because it's with our hearts that we love, that we laugh, and that we experience life. It's with our hearts that we step into relationships and become vulnerable or just put ourselves out there. But it's also with our hearts that we experience heartbreak, that we experience broken relationships. It's also with our hearts that we kind of suck in all the challenges in life and the difficulties and the hardships. And we also experience and absorb all the disruptors in life. And from a small age, because we're so exposed to everything that's out there, our hearts absorb so many disruptors that it grows this callus in our hearts that we begin to lack sensitivity. We hear about something happening somewhere in the world, and if we heard it enough times, it's like, okay, it's not that bad, it's not happening here, right? If there's a flood or a shooting or a war, our hearts grow callous because of these disruptors that take away our sensitivities. And not just with the things that happen out there, but the things that happened around us. And so we'll say stuff and think stuff and do stuff. And because we've lacked sensitivity, our key phrase is, well, that's just the way I am. Either you can have all of me or have none of me. Like, I'm not changing. So how's your heart today? I'm not talking about your career. I'm not talking about your finances. I'm not talking about your family. How's your heart? Like, what do you do to check your heart or modify your heart? What do you do to examine how your heart is? Now, the challenging thing about this, and I'll say this from firsthand experience, is that from a small age, we're not taught to kind of examine our hearts. We are taught to examine our behaviors, right? We're reminded constantly from we're babies all the way to our adult years that if our behavior is outside the lines, then our behavior needs to be modified. And so we're constantly told not to do that or to do that. We're constantly told to go there, not to go there. To eat this, not eat that. To do this, to not do that. And so we're constantly focused on modification of behavior. Now, if you're smart like me, you quickly learn how to modify your behavior, but your heart remains the same. We just adapt what we do and how we do it, or who sees it or who doesn't see it. But our hearts remain the same, or maybe they're even worse off than they were before because we're so focused on the external that no one's checking the internal. Now, no one is going to check your heart for you. No one is. And if anyone tries to check your heart for you, you're going to tell them, mind your business, because you're not the boss of who? Me. And so with time, we begin to build up something that we're going to go through this series called Troubled Hearts, where our temper gets to points where it's just boiling over and we just react. And then the moment after it happened, we're like, I don't know why I said that. I don't know why I reacted the way it just happened. Or there'll be moments in life where we're just soaking in guilt, like we're reminded of something that happened in the past and our heart just grows heavy and it's troubled because we're carrying this baggage. Or maybe it's envy. We see someone posting a picture of a vacation somewhere that we can't afford and we grow envious, like I want to be there. And so we'll say stuff and we'll do stuff. And maybe we'll even rationalize and say, well, that's not like me. Like, it's like that's out of character, but it's coming from somewhere. There's a good text where Jesus begins to address kind of the heart issues of his disciples. And the context of this text is very special because Jesus had just told his followers, he's like, hey, I'm not going to be with you anymore. I'm not going to be physically with you forever. And they started getting troubled. Like outside, themselves, their externals were okay when Jesus was around. But once Jesus says, I'm not going to be with you externally, like physically, their internal heart started getting troubled and anxious and afraid and fearful. And Jesus could tell, because if there's one person that can see your heart, it's not your spouse. It's Jesus. And so he sees their troubled hearts and he says, don't let your heart be troubled. Don't let it be troubled. Like following me doesn't mean having a troubled heart. As a matter of fact, he says, I've shown you a different way. I've shown you a different path. I don't want you to be like those that don't believe, that have troubled hearts. I want you to have a different heart. So I want you to believe in God. I also want you to believe in me. You see, when Jesus said this to his disciples, I think he's saying it to us today as well, and he kind of alludes at something. He doesn't say it directly, but he's alluding to the fact that our hearts can be controlled, that our emotions can be controlled, that we can have a peaceful and restful heart, that there's a way to achieve that and receive that and live with that. So, what if the solution wasn't out there? What if the solution started in here? You see, Jesus says, kind of the antidote to a troubled heart is to believe, right? So if he's asking me to believe in God, that means that I have to learn who God is. In other words, God is God be. And as I learn who God is, then I become something. The center of belief is not modifying my behavior, but the center of my belief starts with my heart believing that God is who he says he is. It also becomes to believe that what Jesus said was true. So this is where I get stuck. If what Jesus said is true, that means I have some work to do. That rhymes. If what Jesus said is true, I have some work to do. And that's not external work, it's heart work. And so that's what this series is about. It's about letting Jesus work in our hearts. It's not about becoming better Christians outwardly, it's about being Christians inwardly. It's not about coming with conclusions or answers to the world's problems, but it's about being one with God and God with me. It's about how we can begin to let go of the emotions that trouble our hearts and cloud our minds. It's beginning to see the world as God sees it, without an anxious spirit. So there's a story, because there's always a story, right? There's a story of Jesus and some people. It's found in Matthew chapter 15, verse 1. And it's interesting that Matthew here highlights a couple of things. He says some Pharisees and teachers of the law came to Jesus, and they're coming from where? Jerusalem. Jerusalem's the capital of Israel, and so that's where all the important people lived, both the leaders of the country, but also the spiritual leaders. So if spiritual leaders such as Pharisees and teachers of the law are coming from Jerusalem, they're not coming on they're not on vacation, they're not just trying to learn the land, they're coming with a purpose, with an agenda. And if they're coming to see Jesus, that means that they have a specific question in mind, not just to learn from Jesus, but to entrap Jesus. Has anyone asked you a question before that they were trying to entrap you? Yeah? Kind of a tricky question where you kind of knew it was going somewhere else, but it wasn't laid out all clearly up front. That's what's happening here. So this is what they ask him. All the way from Jerusalem to ask Jesus this question. Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat. It's an important question, right? How many agree that's an important question? How many parents agree that that's an important question? All right, before they eat or after they go to the bathroom, you want the kids washing their hands. That's their question. They travel all the way to where Jesus was, and they realized that the disciples of Jesus hadn't washed their hands, and most likely the disciples of Jesus didn't wash their hands because Jesus didn't wash his hands. And it's not that Jesus was dirty, he just didn't wash his hands. And if you want to judge Jesus for not washing his hands, I'm sure you probably ate something before without washing your hands, so you've been there. Now, the focus of the Pharisees, the religious rulers, is not so much of the condition of their hearts, but the condition of their hands. They're focused on the tradition of the elders. Now, Jewish people from long time ago had the 10 Commandments that God had given Moses on Mount Sinai. And because they value the 10 Commandments so much, they were so afraid to break one command that they started adding these guardrails, these rules, these policies in order to help them not break any of the big commands. Now, some of these rules were written down. A lot of them were oral, like oral tradition. So either you knew or you didn't know. And so if you can just imagine, you had 10 commands and now you have 1,000 laws surrounding these 10 commands. That's a tough way to live. Because most likely during the day, you're breaking probably hundreds of those other commands, and you're so confused about the hundreds of commands that you're even lost if you're even keeping the 10 commands. So everyone was kind of in confusion, but those that kept the law, the Pharisees and the experts of the law, they knew those laws. One of those laws was to wash your hands before you ate, because it had to do with their ceremonial laws about staying pure and being pure. So if you didn't wash your hands, you were now contaminated, AKA you had the cooties, and you had to go through a process of cleansing yourself in order to be accepted back into the community. A lot of baggage. And so someone broke or accidentally broke one of these commands, and they're confronting Jesus. And so check out Jesus' response. Why do you break the command of God for the sake of tradition? Like, Jesus is not playing around. He's like, okay, you want to play games with me? Let's play games. And so Jesus could see their hearts, and he could see that although they were keeping hundreds and thousands of commands, they were breaking God's law. And so within their time and space, God is saying, you've made up traditions, but you're breaking God's commands, and he breaks it up cleanly. He said it's one thing for God to have rules, it's another thing for man to have rules. It's one thing to be obedient to God, it's another thing to be obedient to men. Because they had lived this way for hundreds of years, those two things for them had become one. So, for example, if you were to go home today and forget to wash your hands, that would be considered breaking one of God's commands. Like, you would have all this guilt while you ate that delicious lunch. And when you have guilt, like, food doesn't taste as good. Imagine life not tasting that good for years. And so God could see their hearts. And he goes on and he says, one of the 10 commandments says, honor your father and mother, and anyone who causes their father or mother is put to death. Okay? This is a commandment. One of the 10 commandments says, honor your father and your mother. Jesus says, but you say, tradition of the elders, that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is devoted to God, in quotation marks, they are not to honor their father or mother with it. Thus, you nullify the word of God for the sake of tradition. So, Jewish people had created this gray area, kind of this loophole, that if you had some extra money and your parents were hungry, or your parents needed a roof over their heads, but you didn't want to use that money on your parents, they had created an opportunity to give that money to the church and for the church to consider it now God's money, and it would just be held there. The church would hold it for a period of time, and actually the period of time was until the parents would die, because then the person would come back and say, hey, I made a donation some time ago that I wanted separated from God, and now God has revealed to me what I need to use that money for, so I need it back. This was one of the traditions. So mom and dad would go hungry until their last breath, but you had separated that money from God and not used it to help them. And so Jesus can see their hearts and saying, I see your traditions. I see your heart. Like, you're breaking one of the 10 commandments and you created these other laws to kind of justify the condition of your heart. And so you can imagine that the Pharisees and experts of the law aren't feeling too friendly towards Jesus, right? If someone is airing your dirty laundry in front of everyone, you might get a little bit upset. And so Jesus is so awesome that he doesn't let off the gas pedal. Like, he floors it. Like, he floors it all the way to the fastest that car could go, and then he does a mic drop. Follow with me. You hypocrites! Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are what? Drops the mic and turns around. People came all the way from Jerusalem to hold him accountable to breaking one of the traditions. And Jesus says, you can come at me all day long with this external stuff. I can see your troubled heart. I can see your messed up heart. I can see envy and jealousy. I can see hatred and anger. Don't come at me with that when your heart is all dirty. And so he calls them hypocrites. And he said, you come to church every single Sabbath, you worship, you sing, you pretend to sing, you lip sing, and you pray or you pretend to pray, you read the Bible, but your heart is far from me. What if we thought today that we were close to God based on what we think we believe, but our hearts don't belong to God? What if we were comfortable in being Christians in this country, in the world we live in, holding on that we're on the right side of things because we have certain things that we believe that are valuable? I'm not arguing those things. I'm just saying, what if that's where we're getting comfort from, but our heart is the same as anyone that doesn't believe? Jesus cares about the externals, but he cares about something else way much more. You see, there's nothing I can do externally to please God. I can't give enough for God to accept me. I can't do enough for God to be proud of me. I can't try to be the best citizen and for God to say, okay, Ruben's doing it right. You know what? Ruben is doing it so well today. Come over here, angels. I need you to take notes as Ruben is living his life. He's such a good human being. You know what? Today, send an extra 3-4 angels to surround him and protect him because he's doing it right. Like, take some angels from that other person not doing it so right. It's not how God works. Because I do external things correctly does not mean that God's going to favor me because I think I'm doing the right thing. God cares about something else way much more than the externals. So most religious systems will do what the Pharisees were doing. You want to join LifePoint? Okay, join LifePoint. Now you need to talk like us, and you need to worship like us, you need to serve like us, and if you have any different ideas, well, you need to go take those somewhere else. Like, that's how we do it here, because it's LifePoint, right? And if you're not fit to be at Life Point. There's many other churches that you can be a part or fit of. Maybe you don't belong in a church, right? Because you're just not changing fast enough. Jesus could see that religious practice, and he saw right through it, and he jumped on the opportunity. Now, he didn't just jump on the opportunity to call the Pharisees out, because the next verse tells us he kind of turns around to the crowd and says, okay, I dealt with them, let me help you. You see, the Pharisees and teachers of the law were supposed to guide the people to God, help them understand God and love God and have a heart like God, but they had done the opposite. So Jesus addresses them, turns to the crowd and says, okay, I want to teach you something. Listen and understand this. Like if you huddle up right now and listen to these words, then your life will be different. Your life will be better. You won't have troubled hearts. And he says, what goes into someone's mouth does not defile them. But what comes out of their mouth is what defiles them, right? Just because you eat stuff you're not supposed to eat, you're not gonna lose your salvation because of that. But what comes out of your mouth does matter more. And so the disciples came to him because they're paying attention to everything. Disciples, I imagine, a little bit scared right now because Jesus called out the Pharisees, right? People they know, the people that were in charge, are like, whoa, Jesus just called them out. Like, we don't know what to feel right now. At the same time, we have no idea what Jesus is talking about. And so they come up to them and say, Jesus, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when you said these words? Like, Jesus, could you come back and tell them you didn't mean it? That maybe you just didn't have lunch yet, and so you were a little bit hangry, and you just need to have some Doritos and calm down a little bit? Like, can we go back and mend offenses here? What does he say? Like, Jesus wasn't messing around that day, right? Leave them. They are blind guides. If the blind lead the blind, both will what? It's like, well, Jesus, but they're the experts. Jesus, they're the ones that memorize the scripture. Jesus, if anyone has it right, it's them. Like, how are they blind? If they're blind, we're super blind. Like, how do we navigate through this, Jesus? So they're super, super, super confused. And now I'm confused. Kristen, if you can help me jump all the way to where we were, thanks. And so Jesus begins to now take an opportunity to speak and minister to his disciples. Because his disciples were confused. Like, they had tried to keep the traditions and weren't able to, so they had guilt. But now Jesus is saying, no, it's not the tradition, it's something deeper, it's something that's in your heart, it goes beyond the rules and the traditions. So I just need you to listen here, Jesus says. And so the next text, I believe, is verse, let me go a little bit, if you can go to verse, maybe keep going a little bit more. Thank you for your patience. All right, there we go. All right, I'll read it. And so he says, leave them, the blind lead the blind. And so, oh, there we go. Awesome. All right. All right, next one. All right, there we go. And so, thank God for Peter. You always need a Peter in the group because a Peter's always going to say what everyone else is thinking. Jesus, can you explain that parable to us? Like, it sounds great, like what comes out, what comes into your mouth doesn't defile what comes out. Like, what does that mean? Can you speak to us in plain language? And Jesus says, now I thought this was just like my translation, NIV, so I went to the Message to get the real stuff. It basically says, why are you acting stupid? That doesn't make it better, does it? So Jesus says, I've tried to roll it out and spell it out. I've tried to show this. I'm about to die on the cross, so I might as well show you one more time. And what Jesus shares here is probably the most important thing any Christian should know, believe, and follow. If there's one thing that we should jump all into, like dive deep and ask God to work in our lives, is this one thing. The one thing that comes from the inside out is probably the purpose of God sending his son to come, the purpose of the law. Here's what he says. Don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then comes out of the body? Like, he's getting real simple, right? You eat stuff, you go to the bathroom. You know how that works? Like, okay, we know how that works. Yeah, we got it, Jesus. All right, stating the obvious. But the things that come out of the person's mouth come from where? And that defiles them. The source of our problem or our troubled heart, the source of our anxiety or the source of our confusion or how lost we are at times is our heart. And if you do a Google search and just put Bible and heart, you'll hit all these Bible texts talking about the heart, because if God knows anything, he knows that our hearts can get troubled often. And so sometimes we'll say things and do things, think things, and we'll say, well, I didn't mean to say that. I think we did mean to say it, we just didn't mean to say it out loud. The stuff that comes into our mind, our heart, doesn't just come out of nowhere, it just doesn't appear. It's formulated somewhere. Jesus is saying that what comes into our mind or comes out of our mouth is being formulated, created, put together in our hearts. Whatever comes out of my mouth is just an x-ray of what's inside my heart. And one of the most challenging things for Christians is that because we know behavior modification so well, we know that we're not supposed to say certain words in certain places or with certain people. I don't know how many times I've heard Christians say like curse words in front of me, or non-Christians, and as soon as they know I'm a pastor, they'll apologize, not because I'm a human being, but because I'm a pastor. They believe that God's presence is with me, and that would be awesome, and that God punishes as people sin in front of me. I haven't seen that happen yet, but when I do, I will update you and share you about that experience. We'll be in church and we'll say something, and some people, will be fun. We'll look around and see if lightning is coming down from somewhere. But then we'll be at home in a relaxed atmosphere and stuff will flow out of our mouths, and it's perfectly fine for us because the people that would judge us for saying those things aren't around. There's someone that's always around. It's not Santa Claus. Jesus cares about the condition of your heart, about what comes out of your heart, about the status of your heart, your troubled heart, your heart full of envy or jealousy or anger. And Jesus wants to work in our hearts. He says, for out of the heart come evil thoughts. Out of the heart. And he names some of them. Murder, idolatry, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. Mark 7 goes into even more detail. He says greed, wickedness, deceit, lustful desires, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All those things that are in our heart, God cares about. He cares more about that than if you come to church or not. He cares more about that than if you tithe or not. He cares more about that if you serve or not. He cares more about that than how you believe or vote on any particular matter in our country and world today. God cares about your heart, about what comes in and comes out of your heart. And he cares so much about your heart that he's willing to sit next to you and expose your heart, and not just expose it, but deal with all the issues in our heart. He says these things and all these things are what defile a person, but eating with unwashed hands does not defile someone. Maybe you've built safeguards around your heart with traditions or rules. Maybe it's Christian traditions or rules or Adventist traditions or rules. I'm not saying, and Jesus is not saying that traditions or rules aren't important or don't have their place or don't have their value. We should have traditions. We should have rules. But if those traditions and rules don't point us to Jesus, don't help us walk with Jesus, don't help other people walk with Jesus, then those rules or traditions should be abandoned because they're not leading us to heaven, they're leading us to hell. Rules and traditions are good, but they should always be based in the love of Christ for me and the love of Christ for the world. And so this is what basically Jesus is saying. That what comes out of my mouth has the potential to destroy myself, destroy my relationship with God, and destroy my relationship with other people. My heart has the potential to destroy things. And if my heart goes unchecked, it will destroy without me noticing one bit. It will begin to destroy and justify. To say that's who I am, that's the way I do things, that's how I speak, that's how I listen, and that's how I move through life. Justifications of a clogged and hardened heart. God today wants to take that heart that's hardened and messed up, and he wants to transform it. Jesus says in John 14:1, he says, don't let your heart be troubled. You don't have to continue to go through life with a troubled heart. He says, I have the antidote for a troubled heart. I have the cure for a troubled heart. If there's any expert, any cardiologist that's expertise in a human heart, it's me. I want to deal with your heart. I want to work with it. I don't care how messed up or used it's been. I can transform it if you give me permission. You see, Jesus doesn't want to add more things to your life or more things to believe or not to believe. He just wants you to release your heart to him. He says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Jesus wants to give your heart rest. And I think, at least in my time, in my lifetime, if there's ever been a time where Christians and non-Christians need someone to say, I can give you rest, it's this time. We're carrying so much baggage and burdens in our hearts, so much things that are unresolved, so many things that are hurting us and hurting others. It's time that we come to Jesus and bring him our weary hearts, bring him our troubled hearts. Let him give you rest. He says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. And you will find rest for what? So as you're thinking about your heart right now, is this something worth trying? Whether you're a Christian of generations of all your life, or maybe this is your first Saturday here watching online, is this worth trying? Is this worth saying, you know what, I don't want to have a troubled heart or a heavy heart. I don't want to carry this guilt or anger anymore. I don't want to have these reactions. I don't want to have these evil desires or just these evil thoughts. God, I want to learn from you. I want to have a gentle heart, a loving heart. I want to have rest. If that's your decision today, I just want to invite you to lift your hands and say, Jesus, I want a restful heart, a restful heart. Put your hands down. Today we have the opportunity of seeing 3 people give their lives to Jesus and say, Jesus, I don't want to have a troubled heart anymore. I want to have a heart that beats after your heart. God, I want you to take over and take the baggage and take all that's broken and begin to do your work. And so maybe today you're here or watching online and you've been listening and you're hearing Jesus' voice in your life and you're hearing Jesus calling you, saying it's time for you to release that troubled heart. Maybe you've been wrestling with a decision to get baptized or give your life to Jesus, and you've been carrying that inside, and it's been hard because you're just lacking the motivation or the courage, or maybe the moment you're maybe saying it's not the right moment. I need to wait for some things to change. Maybe I feel I need to change some things in my life before I can take that next step. Look, if we've learned anything from Jesus' teaching today, that you don't have to do anything. You don't have to change your behavior. You just have to come to him. Bring him your heart. Bring him your trouble. Bring him your need, your crisis. Bring him everything you have. He can handle it. He wants to accept it, and he wants to transform your life into a new life. So if you're here today and you're wrestling with that decision, this is your moment to stand up and say, Jesus, I want to give my life to you today. I want to get baptized and say, Jesus, no more troubled heart, no more wrestling with life on my own, no more trying to change things and forcing situations. Jesus, today, I submit to you. As the worship team sings today, and if that's your desire, please come up front, close to the baptismal pool. We have t-shirts, we have robe, we have something to help you get into that water and for this to be your moment, your day to give your life to Jesus. If you're watching online, please send us a private message. We would love to connect with you, pray with you, and help you along your journey. So as the worship team sings right now, just give you a moment to speak to God, open your heart to God, and let him speak these words of life to you right now.